Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
Tanya van Cuylenburg played tennis and basketball. She loved animals and dreamed of one day having a job where she could work with them. The 18-year-old is dating a young guy named Jay Cook. He's described as sweet and gangly. He plays the bass guitar. They live in Saanich, just outside Victoria, British Columbia. The pair have been dating for about 6 months when Jay asked Tanya if she'd like to go on an overnight road trip south of the border to Seattle. Jay's picking up some furnace parts for his uncle. The couple leave home on a cool, cloudy day. It's November 18th, 1987. Now, I've taken this trip before. It's a stunning journey. Pretty little islands, gorgeous ocean views, the breeze, the salt air. They're traveling in Jay's dad's bronze 1977 Ford van. The couple plan to sleep in it overnight. They take a ferry from Victoria to Port Angeles in Washington State. Then they head to their next ferry en route to Seattle. But Jay never shows up to collect those parts in Seattle. And when Jay and Tanya don't return home the next day, their families are immediately concerned. With no contact from either of them, the pair are reported missing the following day. Then, just a few days later, Tanya's body is found in a wooded area near Mount Vernon. She had been shot in the back of the head. Jay's body is discovered near a bridge over the Snoqualmie River. Jay had been strangled and beaten. For more than 3 decades, their murders remained unsolved. Then on May 18th, 2018, William Earl Talbot was arrested. And a year later, in June 2019, he was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 sentences of life imprisonment without parole. Talbot didn't confess. No witness ever came forward. This all came about because of genealogy research, making Talbot the first person ever to be convicted as a result of genetic genealogy.
I have a personal connection because Jay Cook was a friend of mine. We went to high school together. We graduated together. That homicide, if it had happened in BC, would likely still be unsolved.
That's retired Saanich police officer Chris Horsley. He knew Jay Cook. They went to high school together. But in a recent interview, he also told me that if Tanya and Jay had been killed on this side of the border, Talbot likely would not have been caught. I'm Laura Palmer, and this is Island Crime. In past seasons of Island Crime, I've learned about the huge promise of investigative genetic genealogy, or IGG for short. Time and time again, experts have told me this is the biggest forensic advancement since fingerprints, and that it has the potential to solve the very cases I'm researching and reporting on. Genetic genealogists take the DNA profiles from, say, a crime scene or from unidentified human remains and try to identify close genetic DNA profiles. Ever since the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, there have been hundreds, and perhaps by the time you're listening to this, thousands of cases solved using IGG south of the border. In the States, cases are being solved weekly. Unidentified human remains are being matched with missing people. Killers are being caught. I've even considered quitting podcasting and taking up genetic genealogy. If it's what's solving cold cases, I'm keen to learn more. And yes, we've had some high-profile successes with IGG in Canada as well. But I think it's fair to say that there are some challenges here that are preventing us from reaching the full potential of using IGG as a tool to solve cold cases. And so, when retired detective Chris Horsley tells me that Jay and Tanya's murderer would still be walking around free if they'd been killed in BC, I decide I need to learn more. And so that's the focus of this episode of Island Crime. You'll hear police, scientists, and genealogists' perspectives. I'm shining a light on what's preventing more cold cases in Canada from being solved through investigative genetic genealogy. It's the summer of 2024. I've just released Sweethearts, a season of Island Crime devoted to the unsolved homicides of 3 teenage girls in Victoria. But I can't stop thinking about how IGG could be the best hope for solving these cases. Kimberly Gallup's body was discovered quickly, in a hotel bed. There should be DNA evidence there. Melissa Nicholson was found only a few days after she was killed. Although she was outside, I'm told there is DNA evidence in her case. And then there's Sherry Lynn Smith. She was covered in a blanket. Could there be DNA evidence on that blanket? I think of that blanket a lot, actually, and how in the end it was a blanket recovered at a crime scene that 50 years on led to the identification of Albert DeSalvo as the Boston Strangler. So I can't help but wonder, could the blanket that once covered Sherry Lynn Smith's body, left in a rural area of Saanich, yet yield results like that?
My name is Chris Horsley, and for the better part of 30 years, I was a member of the Saanich Police Department here in Greater Victoria. And the last decade of my career, I was in major crime, the detective division, and I was the detective staff sergeant overseeing various sections within that division.
If you're a regular listener to Island Crime, you'll likely know that I'm an optimist. Despite the dark stories I tell, I'm always hopeful, convinced the cases I cover can be solved, and anxious to find new leads, to learn more about new tools to push investigations forward. So when I talk to Chris, I'm keen to hear his thoughts on investigative genetic genealogy and whether he thinks cases like those of the murdered teenage girls I covered in my Sweethearts season could be solved using IGG.
So here's the challenge. And there's been some very big successes in the United States using the DNA that was located and then matching it through DNA sites such as, Ancestry.com. And then, of course, these genealogists will go through records and try to determine, some sort of family tree, basically, which would identify suspects. That, in a nutshell, is what they're doing. Unfortunately, up in British Columbia, it's a bit of a showstopper, because in BC we have the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act.
Chris isn't the first person to cite privacy concerns when it comes to using IGG. But in this specific instance, he tells me that one of the stumbling blocks to using investigative genetic genealogy in BC has to do with the fact that recent records aren't public in British Columbia.
You don't know, for example, you can't go down and find who I've been married to or how many kids I have. It's not a public record in the province of British Columbia. You would need a search warrant to access that information.
Chris outlines a number of reasons he believes investigative genetic genealogy isn't as promising in solving cases here as I might have thought.
There are some politics involved because of the private lab does not interact seamlessly with our RCMP national lab, but those are all things that we're aware of, and we ensure that we stick handle around all those issues by making sure that if we're sending samples, it's because we have perhaps a known suspect. So I can send a sample to a private lab and get a profile, and then we can do a comparison to a known suspect. And of course, that can go straight to court. What I can't do is send an unknown sample to BCIT and then put it into the National Data Bank. Not allowed to do that. So, there's rules basically, and a lot of the stuff is bound by court decision as well. I don't want to live in a police state probably any more than you do, but some of these rules that are in place or, pieces of legislation to protect us, well, they also hamper certain levels of investigations, and that's the price we pay. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but that's the reality here. And we're so dependent in policing on the judgment of the courts, not just, laws, but also case law. In Canada, the police have far more leeway than police officers in those states. But in some areas, the coin is completely flipped.
Police in Canada don't make the rules, but they do have to work within them and understand that case law and policy is forever changing. As we talk, he raises other issues police must consider before using IGG.
And the other thing you have to remember is when you send an exhibit over and have it tested for DNA, it destroys the exhibit. So you only have so many opportunities to test. You can't just keep retesting it. So in a lot of these homicides, you have to be very mindful that, okay, if we're going to test for DNA, what if technology changes in a year or two and we struck out now, but we've lost the exhibit? People have to understand that when you test for DNA, that's it. You got one shot at it, and then the exhibit would likely be destroyed, right, in the testing process. So depends how much you have to start with.
We'll get into that more in a minute. The next issue he flags is money.
We would like to throw everything at every investigation, but, the money's not limitless. The Saanich Police have a police budget, and, we are sort of bound by the money we have to spend on an annual basis. So in the minute you start going to private laboratories, it starts to get expensive quickly. Sometimes, it's a bit like, the only luck we have is bad luck. You think that, okay, we're going to get lucky here, and it just doesn't work out for us. As we go down these different investigative avenues, they're all solvable. So there's not a murder out there that can't be solved. It's just, trying to get those pieces to fall into place.
Chris Horsley has laid out some of the issues he sees with IGG from a policing perspective. I also want to know how IGG is perceived through a scientific lens. For that view, I turn to the British Columbia Institute of Technology.
My name is Steen Hartson. I work at the British Columbia Institute of Technology in the Forensics DNA Lab.
The biggest change Steen has seen in recent years is sensitivity.
We're able to get good DNA profiles from less DNA than we used to be able to by a fair bit. Like 15, 20 years ago, you needed quite a bit of DNA to get a good profile, and they weren't really looking at, sometimes it's called touch DNA, but it's better description of that would be, I guess, just like low copy DNA. So just small amounts, or trace DNA, just small amounts of DNA. And we're able to get more information out of that smaller amount of DNA, which can be very helpful sometimes, because sometimes at a crime scene, that's all you've got is really small amounts of DNA.
That, coupled with the advent of genetic genealogy, has been a game changer. Steen's IGG journey began with the identification of a man found dead in front of a church in downtown Vancouver. The deceased was a well-known figure in the community, but nobody knew his real name or identity.
And so we were able to use genetic genealogy to solve that case and figure out who that person was and get them in touch with their family. And that was kind of the pilot project that we started genetic genealogy with here at BCIT. And since then, we've solved a couple other files, and we're actively working on quite a few more.
The greatest challenge Steen sees is access, specifically the databases they have access to at this stage.
Right now, you've got access to these two American databases, which are GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. And I say American because they're located there, but they do have people who've uploaded their DNA into that database from Canada as well. But it's a much smaller subset of people in terms of like the database who are from Canada. And so we're kind of limited by who's put their data into the system. Because for this to work, you need to have a bunch of people who've decided to upload their data to these databases for some reason. And that's generally the limiting factor. So we've had cases where we've gotten our data, we've uploaded it to these databases, and you just don't have any matches that are able to help you start to build these family trees. Like the closest relative is a seventh cousin or something like that, which isn't enough information to be helpful. So that tends to be the biggest limitation, because the genetic genealogy part's kind of interesting in that if you get really lucky, and I've talked to an investigator who got really lucky this way, they uploaded their data and a sibling popped up. They're able to solve this case in about 10 minutes.
And it's not just the size of the databases. It's the makeup of them as well.
So if you're not looking for a Caucasian victim or suspect or whoever you're looking for, it becomes even more challenging because a lot of those other people from some of those other ethnic groups haven't uploaded their data to these sites at the same level as people who are Caucasian. And so that can be a big challenge for us here in Vancouver, where we're trying to sometimes, obviously, the human remains could be from any number of ethnicities. If they're not Caucasian, it's quite challenging to solve those.
This is an aspect of genetic genealogy I hadn't heard much about. But from Steen's perspective, one of the biggest reasons preventing more IGG cases from going ahead comes down to caution.
One of the reasons we're generally only doing humanitarian cases at this stage is because the police agencies are still trying to navigate that. They're still trying to figure out, what can I do that's going to meet all the legislation around privacy and make sure that I'm not going to get myself in trouble when it comes time to taking this information to court. Because, at some point, if you're looking for a suspect, they're going to be challenging this type of technology and this type of search. So I would say that is a concern, a big concern, but it's not one that they've really solved yet. And that's why, at least in BC, I can't speak for, I know Ontario is doing this quite a bit, and I know Alberta's done this a little bit as well. But having had some discussions with investigators in BC, that's the major reason why they haven't pursued this more aggressively, is trying to deal with those concerns. And generally, most people are more willing to accept this when you're talking about unidentified human remains, right? No one's at any risk of going to jail. You're really just trying to help a family figure out what happened to a loved one, and there's a lot more support for that.
As well, for all of its promise, IGG remains an expense that some police forces may have trouble making a case for.
The cost kind of depends on a couple factors. There's a couple different ways you can generate that data. Some are cheaper than others. I would say you're probably looking at about $7,500 just to generate the data these days. And then the genealogical cost can kind of depend on how long it takes you to solve the case, right? If it's 10 minutes, it's not going to cost very much, but the longer it takes, the more man hours go into it, the more expensive it gets. But I would say it probably costs about $10,000 a case, somewhere around there. Not insignificant, but you look at some of the resources that go into some of those cases. I had it described to me because, again, we expedite cases sometimes for law enforcement agencies, and sometimes that can be expensive too. But if you've got a surveillance team on a suspect, that can cost like $20,000 a day. So, if these processes are shortening the steps it takes to actually solve some of these cases, there's a lot of ways that you're kind of clawing money back in the long term. So there is definitely a not insignificant upfront cost, but there might be a larger savings to be had in terms of solving these cases a lot more quickly.
I think about some of the historical cases I've covered on Island Crime, about the thousands of police hours, resources that have been devoted down the years. And then I also think about the impact on families and friends and community of these unsolved cases. It's almost impossible to put a price on bringing some kind of justice and peace to families. So yes, there are concerns about legislation, privacy, and police budgets. But in the end, the success of IGG can come down to something we have zero control over: the weather.
It's shocking how much the environment changes our ability to recover DNA, because we've successfully gotten DNA from an 1,800-year-old bone, and then we've failed to get DNA from a bone we know is only 10 years old. And the only difference between those two samples were how those bones were experiencing nature for the last, 1,800 years versus 10 years. So the environment makes a massive difference in how much DNA is recovered.
Really? So the one that you couldn't get DNA from, what were the circumstances?
It was in a really warm and humid location, so it was in kind of like a swampy area, and it wasn't a huge bone piece. It was just kind of a smaller bone fragment, and all the DNA ended up getting degraded. That's, I would say, the worst case scenario for any kind of DNA storage is humid and warm, because that breaks the DNA down more quickly.
Privacy, policy, access to records, costs, the quality of the DNA itself. Clearly, IGG, still in its early stages, is not without its challenges. But there is promise, and there are pioneers. Maclean's magazine describes Toronto police detective Steve Smith as the cop cracking cold cases with DNA.
My name's Steve Smith, and I'm the acting detective sergeant in charge of the Homicide and Missing Persons Unit, Cold Case Unit, as well as a Missing Persons Unit in Toronto.
Can I just begin by asking you broadly how significant you believe investigative genetic genealogy is in solving cold cases now?
Oh, it's an absolute game changer. I mean, especially with us, and I mean, we've been lucky because we have the grant from the provincial government in Ontario, the Solicitor General's grant. So we have money to do this, but it's an absolute game changer in the fact that it allows cases that were stalled and that probably never would have been solved to now be solvable. So I can't even imagine the difference it makes to families that have waited 30, 40, 50 years for answers, and to investigators who now have a new hook into actually being able to investigate cases that for years we knew that we had an offender, we just didn't know who that offender was.
I had one criminologist previously describe it to me as the biggest thing since the fingerprint. Is that overstating things?
No, absolutely. I agree. I mean, once the fingerprints came in and you were able to identify people by their fingerprints, it was a game changer for anything that was left at a crime scene. And one of the good things is, especially for cold cases back in the 70s and 80s, offenders didn't realize that if they had left DNA at the scene, fast forward to 2024, we're now able to identify them from that DNA that they left at the crime scene.
How do you decide which cases to go forward with?
That's always a question. I mean, part of what we've started with is vulnerable members of society, racialized communities, racialized victims, to women, children, sex workers, women that were alone in their homes. But the ideal is that there was a close contact murder. So it was either a strangulation, a stabbing, a beating, something of that sort, where DNA probably would have been transferred during the altercation. Whereas things such as a shooting, if someone's just shooting out of a car at people that are standing farther away, there's not going to be as much transfer of DNA. So we need a good transfer of DNA, and we need to be able to identify that as the offender's DNA, and from there we go forward.
One of the first cases to be solved in Canada using IGG was that of Christine Jessup.
In the early 80s, unfortunately, a 9-year-old girl went missing up in York region of Ontario.
Christine lived in a village called Queensville. It's just north of Toronto. But back in 1984, it must have seemed a world away. A rural area with just a few homes, a store, and a church. A quiet place for a little pig-tailed kiddo like Christine to grow up in. In an article written for Toronto Life magazine, Christine is described in loving detail.
Christine, the little girl with the crooked front tooth, high socks, and low pigtails, was an explorer, an independent and imaginative kid who would happily spend hours playing in the cemetery behind her house. She loved baseball, just like her brother Kenny, 5 years her senior, and she cherished her dolls. Her deepest affection, however, was reserved for animals. Her dog, a beagle named Freckles, was her constant companion. She kept a pet frog, Harold, in the moist, dirt-floored basement. She once slept outside beside baby chicks so they wouldn't be alone overnight.
On the afternoon of Wednesday, October 3rd, Christine hopped off the school bus and popped into a store to buy some gum. Then she vanished.
She was missing for about 4 months. The entire community came together. It was a small community, and they were looking for her. Unfortunately, 4 months later, they found her deceased. They were able to, upon autopsy, find out she was stabbed to death, and they were able to find semen on her underwear. Obviously, in the 80s, you weren't able to do anything with it because DNA hadn't become a thing yet. So the investigation went on, and unfortunately, a neighbor was arrested. Guy Paul Moran was arrested and charged and actually inevitably convicted of killing Christine. When DNA became a thing in the 90s, his lawyer actually took his DNA, matched it up against the DNA from the semen where there was an STR profile created, and it showed that he was not the person that left that semen on her underwear. So he was exonerated at that point. Fast forward, there was a government review of everything that happened in that case, which is one of the landmark cases in really how we deal with evidence now in policing and the justice system. And because of that, this case was moved to Toronto to investigate. So we took that on. And when we first learned of IGG, that was one of the first cases that we thought of. One, because, it's obviously a vulnerable young 9-year-old girl that was taken from her home, abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered. And two, also because there was someone wrongfully convicted in this case. So it shows the power of IGG, not that it can only identify the actual offender, but it can make sure that nobody is going to be wrongfully convicted of these offenses. So we picked that case to go on with, and we sent it down. It was the very first case that we sent down. We received results from it and began to build our family trees. And over the course of about 8 or 9 months, we were actually able to identify the offender in that case. Unfortunately, he was deceased prior to us identifying him, but we were able to identify him, completely exonerate the person that was wrongfully convicted if there was any doubt of that, and actually tell the families who had actually killed their daughter.
Christine's killer was a family acquaintance named Calvin Hoover. He helped search for Christine. He attended her wake in her home. And then, in 2015, he died by suicide. A child killer identified. A wrongly convicted man exonerated. The potential with IGG really is jaw-dropping. And as you can tell, Detective Smith is keen. But he's also clear-eyed about the challenges he faces.
If we had access to Ancestry.com, we'd be able to solve every cold case in the world because there's so many profiles on that site. Our problem right now, and it's changing as we go. In the last 5 years, it's changed immensely, but it's the diversity of the sites. So we're able to identify anybody with Northern European ancestry, but it's not diverse enough to identify all the offenders and all the unidentified human remains, unfortunately.
What's the holdup there, or what is preventing that from happening?
I think honestly, it's probably just education. I mean, obviously people in North America know of IGG and know of these sites because they are primarily North American sites. So we try to educate people. We try to get the word out there that if you have done a kit on any of these other sites and you want to help the police, please bring your DNA profile over to GEDmatch and or Family Tree DNA for us so we can utilize this to solve more crimes. But I believe in other parts of the world, IGG isn't as prevalent. There's not as much known about it. And places like China and such, I don't imagine there's a lot that gets into China saying that this is going on and this is how you can help the police by uploading your DNA. We kind of did a test when we were doing our press conferences on both Jessup and Tyson Gilmore. We wanted to see whether when we did our press conference, if people were going to take their DNA off these sites or people were going to add to it. And we found with both our press conferences and the days following, we had about 5,000 people actually upload to these sites in both instances. So it's really just an education factor.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you were looking at that to see what would happen.
Yeah, absolutely, because we didn't know if it was going to be beneficial for us to do these and have people realize and think, well, I want to help the police too, so I'm going to move my kid over from my pay-per-use site to Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch.
Right. Yeah. So I actually took that step and did that in part because I want to be helpful, but also just so I could see what that process looked like. Do you think it really is education, or do you think there is that concern about privacy? Like, what do you think is stopping people?
Oh, I imagine there's a few people that are concerned about privacy. I imagine there's some others that don't really want to help the police, which is fine in both of those. But I really think it's an education thing. We've been finding that people just don't watch the news anymore. They don't listen to the news. I mean, podcasts, those sort of things are the way to get out to people now. But the general news, a lot of people don't pay attention. And we've spoken to numerous people that have their DNA up on Ancestry or 23andMe. And when we explained to them that they can pour it over to help us, they had no idea. So it's really trying to get this education out to everybody that has their DNA up on these sites. As far as privacy, I'm sure there are some people that are concerned of privacy, but in reality, we never see their DNA or anything. All we see is the fact of how close of a relation they are to a case that we're looking at. So we don't ever see anything about this person or know anything about this person other than basically their name and the fact that they're a second, third, fourth, or first cousin to our offender and or our unidentified person.
I asked Detective Smith just what he thinks is stopping police forces in Canada from using IGG more frequently. He acknowledges the price tag, but also mentions the knowledge gap.
It took us about 2 or 3 months of immersing ourselves in IGG to understand it. And even though we thought we had a good grasp over the following 3 years, we've learned so much. You have to educate yourself. So as a police officer, that's not something that we normally do. And a lot of places don't have cold case units. So they have people basically working off the corner of their desk while they're doing current homicides and trying to look back at old homicides. So there's a lot of factors that come into play there. Everything that we can work through, but it's really a willingness of the police service and the command of the police service to actually embrace this technology.
I talked to a retired Calgary detective who told a very similar story about them really having to just dig in and learn this themselves, that there wasn't really a roadmap or anybody to tell them what to do. Now that we're a few years into it, is that a next step? Like, is there going to be, or do you envision some sort of national framework or something that could provide some guidance to people across the board?
Absolutely. I mean, I would love that. That's something I've been pitching. I mean, obviously now with our grant, part of our grant is to service all the police services in Ontario. So that's great for them because they can come to us. We can provide them with the knowledge they need and the services that they need. But then we hand them back the investigative lead. So they're able to follow up on that and do the investigation themselves. But we're able to walk them through the process of doing IGG. And hopefully other people catch on to this and start to learn about it and they're able to do it themselves as well. But one of the things was I wanted an Ontario framework for this as well as a Canadian framework and hopefully funded by the federal government to actually do this across Canada. And if we brought in the right people, we could have a group that could go and actually liaise with every service in Canada to make sure that this is done right.
In the U.S., the Department of Justice developed an interim policy to govern the use of IGG. Here in Canada, we have no national framework, no laws governing IGG. This is changing and evolving daily. But at this time, Canadian courts, too, have had limited experience with IGG.
We've had a handful of cases go through court. Defense lawyers have brought up Section 7 and Section 8 arguments. They've all been turned away by the judges. We've also had a number of guilty pleas in IGG cases where people have admitted to, yes, they were the offender. A lot of these cases, and it's 40 years later, it's pretty hard for somebody to explain how their DNA was at a horrific crime scene 40 years ago and they didn't come forward to say, oh, I knew this person, here's my information. That DNA evidence is pretty damning once you put all the factors together and show that this person was at that crime scene at the time of the offense.
When Detective Smith refers to Section 7 or 8 arguments, he's referring to Canada's charter rights of privacy and security. But Detective Smith believes violent rapists and murderers simply don't deserve to have those rights protected.
If you've murdered and sexually assaulted a 9-year-old girl and you've left your DNA at that crime scene, you've given up your right to that DNA as privacy. And I think any judge upon balancing that would say, well, this person committed this crime, left their DNA there, and now we've utilized it to identify them. That's not a breach of their privacy. But nobody else do we go into their privacy at all. On these sites, everybody is agreeing to the fact of police involvement. So, I've had numbers of conversations with the Privacy Commission, and we actually have a fairly good rapport. But I say 99% of the Canadian public, if they knew that one of their relatives committed a heinous sexual assault and murder, they would call the police and say, it's my cousin, my aunt, my uncle, whoever. Well, this is basically just Canadians being able to use their genetics to dial 911 for them. So they're putting their genetics up. We're utilizing it to identify their offenders, and they're helping us out. So they're basically utilizing their genetics to say, if it is somebody in my family that's committed these terrible crimes, we want them to stand trial for it.
IGG, the biggest investigative innovation since the fingerprint. But Detective Smith says very few Canadian police are using it.
In all honesty, it's a small community. It's a very small group of people that are actually utilizing this. We do a lot of presentations, and as we do our presentations, the group becomes a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger of people actually hearing about it and understanding it.
I'm trying to wrap my head around some of the other possible explanations for why some Canadian police forces, and perhaps the Canadian public as well, may be reluctant to embrace IGG. One possible explanation is scope creep. That's the idea that, right now, IGG is being used to catch rapists and murderers. But how would you feel about IGG tracking down someone who maybe stole a candy bar?
In my opinion, I have no appetite for that. Right now, anyway, this is utilized only for the most serious offenses, and that's all I would want to utilize it for. I don't have interest in going back to break and enters from the 90s and bringing someone before justice for that. I mean, obviously I would like to solve that, but I don't think that this is the way to do it. I think this needs to be kept just on the most serious, most heinous, most awful offenses, such as homicide, sexual assault, and of course the humanitarian side of unidentified human remains. Those are the only three things right now that I have any appetite, and pretty much anybody that I've spoken to in the Canadian policing community has any appetite to utilize this for.
Earlier in this episode, Detective Chris Horsley expressed doubts regarding whether IGG could overcome the challenges of Canada's privacy laws. Detective Smith understands the concern, but believes Canadian genealogists are up to the task.
We hired Canadian genealogists on staff, and one of the reasons is because Canadian genealogists know how to navigate our privacy laws. In the US, it's much different, but if you're paying money to a US lab to do your genealogy for you, don't expect great results if the DNA isn't a really close match, because in the US, they have so much more access to open source data. I don't want to say easier, but it's very different for the genealogists down there. The US genealogists, when they come to Canada, because of our privacy and because we don't have access to all these different aspects that are out there, they usually get frustrated with our laws and the ability to find people within Canada. So that's why we've hired our own Canadian genealogists that are specialists in this.
When he refers to open source data, he's talking about everything from obituaries and birth notices to Facebook accounts and so much more. Really, anything that can be found to build out family relationships. I think about the families I've met over the years with missing or murdered loved ones. Detective Smith tells me he's hearing directly from victims' families who are now wondering if IGG could be possible in their loved ones' cases. If there are police listening who are, feeling reluctant or cautious, like just hesitant about the whole thing, what would your guidance be to them?
Give us a call. Give us a call in Toronto. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to go ahead, but we can answer all your questions and give you the information that you need to move forward on this and actually take a look at it and see if it's going to work for you or not.
You mentioned off the top the funding. What happens for you guys when that funding runs out?
We need consistent funding for this. We'd love to start with Ontario, but eventually it needs to be Canada, because there's going to be small police services that only have one or two cases that they want to utilize for this. Well, it's not in their best interest to go out and spend 6 or 8 months learning about this to do one or two cases. So if we had a Canadian perspective on this, where we could take experts from one area and lend them to help police in other areas for their one or two cases and walk them through the process, it would be a much more efficient process for us.
Detective Smith referenced the team of genealogists working with the Toronto Police Cold Case Unit. And it turns out one of the members on that team is from right here on Vancouver Island. And we actually met briefly at the annual Walk for Justice for Lisa Marie Young in Nanaimo.
So my name is Lauren Robillard. I'm 25. I was born in New Westminster in BC and adopted and raised on Vancouver Island in Mill Bay, which is a very small town. In 2018, I got into genealogy a little bit, first with my adoptive family, and then that led to me wanting to find my own biological parent. In the spring of 2023, I started volunteering with Toronto Police, working on John and Jane Doe cases.
About once a week, Lauren heads into Toronto Police headquarters. But for the most part, she works from home.
My day usually starts checking the current project that we're working on, checking for new matches on both of the sites that we use. And then I just get to work. And sometimes this could be just like building out the trees or down treeing. So if we have a couple that we know that the doe or the suspect is descended from, then we're kind of working back down the tree instead of building it out. It's just like all different genealogy tasks within our current case. And, we work kind of all hours sometimes. Like it can be late at night and a new match will pop up, and or my boss will get contacted by someone who's agreed to help, and then we'll just work on it at all hours.
When Lauren refers to genealogy tasks, that can mean turning to a wide variety of sources.
When we're building someone's tree out, we use, records from Ancestry, from newspapers.com, from, obituaries on Google, social media, just a wide variety of resources for building the actual tree.
Lauren tells me she learned quickly that IGG is harder than the kind of genealogy she was tinkering around with at the outset. And that to some extent, that comes down to limitations of using the two smaller databanks law enforcement has access to.
I typically work with someone's ancestry DNA results, and often I don't have to use any other sites. Their matches on Ancestry are good enough. But for these cases that we do, so either John and Jane Doe or crime cases, which are like murders and sexual assaults, we are allowed to use two sites, so GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. So these sites allow law enforcement to work with them, and the files are uploaded to these two sites only. So as a result, we're working with a match list that is a lot smaller than Ancestry DNA.
And she adds that it's not just the differences in the size of the databanks she can access. It's the quality of the DNA itself that can present challenges.
We're using often old DNA that's maybe been underwater or, not preserved well. It's not like an ancestry test where you're spitting in a tube and your DNA is like fresh off your cheek. Like the DNA that's submitted is often, from bones or molars. It's dead DNA basically.
Despite those obstacles, she's a believer in IGG.
I think there's a lot of power and potential for cases to be solved. You have to think of the families that have missing and murdered relatives, and this is a way to help them, and that people, doing a DNA test and uploading to these two sites, they're helping. I guess for me, it's like, why wouldn't you want to help with that?
Someday, Lauren hopes to use her expertise to assist in solving some of the island's unsolved murders and missing people cases.
I would love to even just volunteer my time to help some of these BC cases get solved. I mean, I grew up, hearing about all the island cases, like Michael Dunning, was a big one, Lindsay Nichols, Jordan Halling. One I'd really love to see solved is Lindsay Buziak. If there's DNA from these violent crimes cases, I think it would be a good time to start putting some funds towards genealogy because, it is solving so many cases.
I began trying to understand what's happening with IGG across the country as a result of my work on the Sweethearts series. It seems to me the cases of Sherry Lynn Smith, Melissa Nicholson, and Kimberly Gallup could be potentially solvable using investigative genetic genealogy. It's the reason I called up Detective Chris Horsley in the first place. I asked him about the blanket that was once used to cover Sherry Lynn Smith's body as it laid in the bushes in a rural area of Saanich during the summer of 1990.
Yes, anything of that nature, because we would, someone who's covered with a blanket, well, when she was working downtown Victoria, she didn't have a blanket. So you can assume the blanket came from the suspect or the suspect's vehicle. So yes, things like that can be tested.
The issues preventing Canadian cases from being solved are real, but they aren't intractable. Education, political will, and funding might mean families denied justice for decades could yet have answers. Detective Steve Smith and genealogist Lauren Robillard have told me they are open to answering questions from police or family members who think they have a case that could be solved through IGG. It's a generous offer, and I hope someone here on Vancouver Island takes them up on it. I'm Laura Palmer, and this is Island Crime.